September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The largest fleet ever assembled in the Pacific, rode at anchor beneath a low grey sky. Battleships, carriers, cruisers and destroyers stretched across the water in every direction, their hulls still wearing the dull grey war paint of a conflict that had consumed 60 million lives. On the deck of the USS Missouri, a table had been set with the formal instrument of Japan's surrender. Every camera, every microphone, every pair of eyes in the Allied world was trained on that ship. Correspondents from 100 newspapers jostled for position. Admirals and generals in pressed uniforms stood in rows. The war was over. The empire that had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered Southeast Asia, and fought across 6,000 miles of ocean had been broken, completely, irreversibly, and in a manner so total that the nation which had launched it could barely feed its own people. And the man who had broken it was about to sign his name. Fleet Admiral Chester William Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean areas, stepped forward and signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States. His hand was steady, his expression betrayed nothing. He had commanded the largest naval campaign in human history, from the disaster of Pearl Harbor to the ashes of Hiroshima, and now it was finished. But later that day, after the signatures were dry and the cameras had been packed away and the diplomats had returned to their quarters, Nimitz did something that no reporter recorded and no newsreel captured. He left the Missouri. He traveled across Tokyo Bay to the Yokosuka Naval Base, the same base that had served as home port for the Imperial Japanese Navy for more than 70 years, and he walked onto the deck of a ship. Not an American ship, a Japanese ship. A ship that had not moved under its own power in more than 20 years. A ship whose hull was encased in concrete, whose guns had been removed, whose superstructure had been partially stripped by the very occupation forces Nimitz now commanded. A ship that, to any officer passing by that afternoon, looked like a rusting, concrete-bound hulk with no military value whatsoever. Nimitz stood on that deck and gave an order. He ordered a detachment of United States Marines to stand guard over the ship. Not to occupy it, not to search it for intelligence, to protect it, to keep anyone, American or otherwise, from looting or further damaging what was left. The ship was the Mikasa, and if you had asked any Japanese sailor alive that day to name the single most sacred vessel in their nation's naval history, the Mikasa is the name they would have given without hesitation. She was the flagship of Admiral Togo Heihachiro at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The most decisive naval engagement since Trafalgar, the battle that made Japan an empire and changed the history of the 20th century. She was to Japan what HMS Victory is to Britain, what the USS Constitution is to America. She was the ship on which a nation's pride had been built, and the American admiral who had just finished destroying that nation's navy was now posting guards to save her. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about this history. And if you are new here, subscribe. To understand why Nimitz did what he did on that September afternoon, and to understand why what he did still matters in Japan more than 80 years later, you need to know 3 things. You need to know who Togo was and why his name carried the weight of a century. You need to know what the Mikasa meant, not as a warship, but as a symbol. And you need to know about a garden party in Tokyo in the summer of 1905, where a 20-year-old American midshipman shook the hand of the most famous admiral in the world, and never forgot it for the rest of his life. But first, you need to understand what was happening across Japan in the autumn of 1945. Because Nimitz's order to guard the Mikasa was not just unusual. In the context of what the Allied occupation was doing to Japan at that moment, it was almost unthinkable. When General Douglas MacArthur assumed command of the occupation as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, his mandate was sweeping, deliberate, and total. Japan's military culture, the culture that had produced Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, and the brutality of a war fought across the Pacific, was to be dismantled. Not reformed, not softened, dismantled from its foundations. The Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy were abolished entirely. Military academies that had trained officers for generations were shut down and their buildings repurposed. Former officers were stripped of their rank and barred from public life. Samurai swords, many of them family heirlooms passed down through centuries, irreplaceable works of art in folded steel, were confiscated by the tens of thousands. Most were destroyed or shipped to the United States as souvenirs. Shinto shrines with military connections were defunded and stripped of state support. Monuments to military victories were torn down or allowed to decay into ruin. The message was deliberate, and it was meant to be permanent. The symbols of Japan's military past were to be erased so thoroughly that the culture which had produced them could never reassemble itself. The Mikasa was caught in this machinery. Across Yokosuka, occupation troops were already stripping her. Her masts were taken down. Her remaining guns and armament were removed. Bridge equipment, navigation instruments, artifacts, anything that could be carried away as a souvenir, disappeared into the pockets and duffel bags of American servicemen who saw the old ship as a source of war trophies. Within months, someone erected a Quonset hut on her deck, and the ship was converted into an entertainment venue for occupation troops. A dance floor was laid where Togo had once paced. Swing bands and jazz quartets played where the Z flag had flown. The place was called Club Mikasa by some accounts. Others referred to it as Cabaret Togo. Later, part of the hull was converted into an aquarium. Fish tanks were installed inside the armoured compartments, where Japanese sailors had loaded 12-inch shells during the most important naval battle of their nation's history. This was not random vandalism by a few disrespectful soldiers. This was the logical endpoint of a policy. The systematic removal of Japan's military identity, carried out under orders, with the full authority of the occupation behind it. Every dance band that played on that deck, every souvenir pried loose from a bulkhead, every fish tank installed in a gun turret, was a small act of erasure in a much larger campaign. And into the middle of that campaign walked Chester Nimitz, the highest-ranking naval officer in the Pacific, the man who had done more to destroy Japanese military power than any other individual alive, ordering United States Marines to protect the one ship that symbolized everything the occupation was trying to erase. The question is not whether Nimitz had the authority to give that order. He was a 5-star fleet admiral. He did. The question is why he gave it. And the answer begins 40 years before that September afternoon, on the other side of the Pacific, in a place and a moment that no one present could have known would matter as much as it did. In January of 1905, a 20-year-old Texan named Chester Nimitz graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. He finished 7th in a class of 114 midshipmen. He was not from a naval dynasty. He was not from money. He was not from the East Coast establishment that dominated the officer corps of the early 20th century. He was from Fredericksburg, Texas, a small town in the hill country settled by German immigrants in the 1840s, a place so far from the ocean that the nearest saltwater was 300 miles away. His father had died before Chester was born. He was raised in part by his grandfather, Charles Henry Nimitz, a former German merchant seaman who had come to Texas, built a hotel shaped like a steamship, and taught his grandson something that Chester carried for the rest of his life. The old man told him that the sea, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster, and that the best way to get along with either is to learn all you can, then do your best, and do not worry, especially about things over which you have no control. After graduation, Nimitz was assigned to the battleship USS Ohio and sailed for the Western Pacific. He was a fresh-faced midshipman on his first major deployment, seeing the world from the deck of a warship for the first time. In the summer of 1905, while the Ohio was stationed in East Asian waters, something happened that would shape the trajectory of Nimitz's entire life, though he could not have known it at the time. He attended a garden party at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. The party was held to honor Japan's naval heroes, and the guest of honor was a man whose name, at that precise moment in history, was the most celebrated in the world, Admiral Togo Heihachiro. To understand what that name meant in the summer of 1905, you need to understand what had happened in the Strait of Tsushima 3 months earlier, because Tsushima was not merely a naval battle. It was one of those rare events that redraw the map of the world. It was the moment when an Asian nation defeated a European great power in a full-scale modern naval engagement for the first time in recorded history. It shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. It ended the Russo-Japanese War. It launched Japan into the ranks of the world's great powers, and it made the man who won it immortal. Togo Heihachiro was born in 1848 in the Satsuma domain of southern Japan during the last decades of the Tokugawa shogunate, in a world of samurai swords and feudal lords. He grew up in one of the most turbulent periods in Japanese history, the era of the Meiji Restoration, when Japan transformed itself from a feudal society closed to the outside world into a modernizing nation determined to compete with the Western powers that had forced it open. Togo joined the fledgling Imperial Japanese Navy as a young man, and in 1871, at the age of 23, he was sent to England to learn the craft of naval warfare from the nation that had mastered it. He spent 7 years in Britain. He studied at the Thames Nautical Training College aboard the training ship HMS Worcester, learning navigation, seamanship, gunnery, and the mathematics of naval architecture. He travelled to British shipyards and watched ironclads being built. He studied the Royal Navy's traditions, its discipline, its tactical doctrines. And on October 21st, 1873, Trafalgar Day, the young Japanese cadet stood aboard HMS Victory in Portsmouth Harbour for the annual commemoration of Nelson's greatest battle. He stood on the deck where Nelson had fallen. He saw the ship from which the most famous signal in naval history had been hoisted. England expects that every man will do his duty. That day changed everything for Togo. He did not merely admire Nelson, he absorbed Nelson. He absorbed the philosophy that a naval commander must be willing to stake everything on a single decisive engagement. The idea that audacity, properly calculated, is the highest form of strategy. The belief that a fleet, handled with enough aggression and enough skill, could destroy an enemy so completely that the war ends in a single afternoon. He studied Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar, the bold approach in 2 columns, the willingness to accept devastating fire during the closing phase in exchange for the chance to shatter the enemy line at close range, and he carried those lessons home to Japan. Over the next 3 decades, Togo rose steadily through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He commanded the cruiser Naniwa during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, where he made the controversial decision to sink a British transport carrying Chinese troops, a decision that nearly provoked an international incident, but demonstrated the decisiveness that would define his command style. He was methodical, quiet, and possessed a calm under pressure that his subordinates found either deeply reassuring or slightly unnerving, depending on the situation. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who displayed emotion in front of his officers. He studied, he planned, and when the moment came, he acted without hesitation. By 1904, when war broke out between Japan and Russia over competing imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea, Togo was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, and his flagship was the Mikasa. The Mikasa herself was a remarkable ship. She was a pre-dreadnought battleship built by Vickers, Sons, and Maxim at their shipyard in Barrow in Furness, England. She had been ordered in 1898 for a price of £880,000, equivalent to 8.8 million yen, laid down on January 24, 1899. Launched on November 8, 1900, and completed on March 1, 1902. She displaced roughly 15,140 long tons. She was 432 feet long. She carried 4 12-inch guns in 2 twin turrets, fore and aft, plus 14 6-inch secondary guns mounted in casemates along her sides. She could make about 18 knots, and she carried a crew of roughly 830 officers and men. She was armoured with the latest Krupp-cemented steel. She was the last and most powerful of 6 capital ships that Japan had ordered from British shipyards as part of an ambitious naval expansion program following the Sino-Japanese War, and she was named after Mount Mikasa in Nara, a site associated with the Japanese imperial family. On May 27, 1905, Togo stood on the Mikasa's bridge in the Strait of Tsushima and waited. Wireless telegraphy, a technology barely a decade old, had given him early warning. The Russian 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons were approaching. These were the fleets that Tsar Nicholas II had sent halfway around the world to avenge Russia's losses in the Pacific. Under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, the Russian fleet had sailed roughly 18,000 miles from the Baltic Sea, one of the longest and most punishing naval voyages ever attempted. They had left the port of Libo in October of 1904, sailed across the North Sea, where they accidentally fired on British fishing trawlers in a fog of nerves and nearly triggered a war with Britain, rounded the coast of Africa, because the deep draft of the newest battleships made the Suez Canal impractical, and because passing through British-controlled waters carried serious diplomatic risks after the North Sea incident, crossed the Indian Ocean in equatorial heat that turned the lower decks of the warships into ovens, and finally passed through the waters of French Indochina before turning north toward the strait between Japan and Korea. The voyage had taken more than 7 months. The hulls of the Russian ships were so thickly fouled with tropical marine growth that their speed had been reduced by several knots. The crews were exhausted, many of them suffering from tropical diseases contracted during coaling stops in African and Asian ports. Morale was shattered. Many of the newer ships had been crewed by reservists who had never fired their guns in anger. Gunnery practice had been minimal during the voyage because ammunition was limited and every shell might be needed in battle. Some of the ammunition they carried was defective, with fuses that did not detonate reliably on impact. They were, in every measurable way, a fleet that had been worn down to its bones by the journey itself before the fighting even began, and they were sailing directly into the home waters of a trained, rested, well-supplied and superbly led fleet that had been preparing for this exact moment for months. Togo had every advantage, and he intended to use them all. As the Russian fleet came into sight, he ordered a signal hoisted on the Mikasa's mast. It was the Z flag, and the message it carried would become the most famous signal in Japanese naval history. The Empire's fate depends on the result of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. The Mikasa led the Japanese battle line directly across the path of the approaching Russian fleet, concentrating fire on the leading Russian warships, while they could bring only a fraction of their guns to bear in response. The gunnery was devastating. Japanese shells, loaded with a high explosive compound called shimose powder, struck the Russian ships and started fires that could not be controlled. The Russian flagship Knyaz Suvorov was battered into a burning wreck within the first hour. Rozhestvensky himself was severely wounded by shell fragments. Ship after ship in the Russian line was hit, set ablaze, and either sunk or crippled. The battle lasted through the afternoon and into the following day. When it was over, the result was unlike anything the modern world had seen. Almost every Russian warship had been sunk, captured, or driven to seek internment in neutral ports. Only 3 small vessels out of the entire Russian armada managed to reach the safety of Vladivostok. The Russian losses were staggering in human terms. Roughly 4,800 sailors killed, more than 6,000 taken prisoner, many of them wounded, nearly 2,000 interned in neutral ports. The total tonnage of Russian warships destroyed was nearly 200,000 tons, representing over 90% of the entire fleet, against Japanese losses of a single 265-ton torpedo boat. The casualty ratio, the tonnage ratio, the sheer completeness of the destruction, all of it was without precedent in modern naval warfare. The Mikasa herself did not escape unscathed. She was the leading ship in the Japanese line, the most visible target, and the Russians knew it. She absorbed at least 32 direct hits during the battle. Over 100 of her crew were killed or wounded, but she stayed in the line. She kept firing, and when the guns finally fell silent over the Strait of Tsushima, she was still afloat, still operational, still carrying Togo's flag. Tsushima ended the Russo-Japanese War. The Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by President Theodore Roosevelt in the United States, followed in September. Japan took its place among the great powers of the world. The shock waves of the victory traveled far beyond the Pacific. Across Asia, colonized peoples took note. If Japan could defeat a European empire at sea, then European dominance was not inevitable and not permanent. Historians would later trace lines from Tsushima to independence movements in India, China, and across Southeast Asia. In Russia, the humiliation of the defeat fueled the revolutionary unrest of 1905 and planted seeds that would bring down the Tsar 12 years later. In Britain, the Royal Navy studied Tsushima with obsessive intensity and used its lessons to accelerate the development of the all-big-gun dreadnought battleship, a new class of warship so powerful that it rendered every pre-dreadnought in every navy on Earth, including the Mikasa herself, obsolete virtually overnight. A single battle in a remote strait had reshaped the political and military landscape of the entire world. And Togo became, in the eyes of the global press and public, the Nelson of the East. Western newspapers used that phrase deliberately, and Togo would not have objected. He had modelled his entire philosophy of command on the man whose ship he had stood aboard as a young cadet in Portsmouth 32 years earlier. The timing of his victory celebrations was no accident. On October 21st, 1905, the exact centenary of the Battle of Trafalgar, Togo attended a Nelson Memorial Banquet at Yokohama alongside Admiral Sir Gerard Noel, the British Commander-in-Chief of the China Station. The next day, Togo rode through the streets of Tokyo beneath a triumphal arch to report to Emperor Meiji. The day after that, the Emperor reviewed a grand naval fleet of more than 150 warships at Yokohama, with Togo aboard the imperial yacht presenting each ship and its wartime record. The clustering of these events around the Trafalgar centenary was a deliberate act of homage that every naval officer in the world understood. But Togo was not merely a tactician of extraordinary ability. He was also a man of uncommon decency. After the battle, when the wounded Admiral Rojestvensky was brought to a Japanese naval hospital, Togo went to visit him personally. He spoke to the defeated Russian commander with courtesy, with warmth, and with the kind of respect that one professional extends to another who has done his duty under impossible conditions. The visit was reported around the world, and it cemented Togo's reputation not just as a warrior, but as a man who understood that honor does not stop when the shooting stops. Destroying an enemy and respecting him were not contradictions. They were, in the hands of a man like Togo, expressions of the same principle. Now, back to that garden party in Tokyo, in the summer of 1905. Midshipman Chester Nimitz, 20 years old, lanky, quiet, and utterly unknown, stood among a crowd of senior naval officers and foreign dignitaries who had come to celebrate Japan's victory. He was nobody, a junior midshipman from a landlocked Texas town on his first overseas deployment, wearing a uniform that still felt new. Across the garden, surrounded by admirers and officials, stood the most famous military figure alive. Togo was 57 years old. He was quiet, slight in build, and carried himself with a stillness that the people who met him routinely described as absolute calm. He looked, one observer noted, like a man who had never been in a hurry in his life. Nimitz approached. They spoke briefly, a handshake, a ceremonial sip of champagne, a few words, brief but cordial, perhaps through an interpreter, perhaps not. The encounter lasted a few minutes at most, but Nimitz never forgot it, not in the passing way that people remember a brush with celebrity, in a deeper way. In the way a young man recognizes, in the bearing and character of an older man, the kind of commander he wants to spend his life becoming. Togo represented something to Nimitz that transcended nationality or politics. The idea that a naval officer could be both ferocious in battle and generous in its aftermath, that the highest expression of command was not just winning, but the manner in which you treated the men you had beaten. Nimitz absorbed that idea at the garden party, and it became part of him. The decades passed. Togo ascended to the pinnacle of Japanese national life. He was appointed to serve as naval tutor to Crown Prince Hirohito, the future emperor, from 1914 to 1924. He was elevated to the rank of Marquis. His image appeared on stamps, in schoolbooks, on recruiting posters. In every Naval Academy classroom in the Empire, his portrait hung on the wall. He became not just a hero, but a symbol, the living embodiment of what Japan believed about itself. And the Mikasa became the physical anchor of that belief. After the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 imposed limits on the world's navies, the Mikasa was decommissioned in 1923. But there was never any question of scrapping her. A Mikasa Preservation Society was formed in 1924, with Togo himself as honorary chairman. The signatory powers to the treaty agreed that the ship could be kept as a permanent memorial, provided her hull was encased in concrete and her armament rendered permanently inoperable. She was towed to Yokosuka in 1925 and formally dedicated on November 12, 1926, in a ceremony attended by Crown Prince Hirohito and the elderly Togo himself. Before the Second World War, the Mikasa drew as many as 500,000 visitors a year. Japanese schoolchildren made pilgrimages to walk her decks the way British schoolchildren crossed the gangway onto the Victory. The ship was not merely a museum, she was a national shrine. She was the place where modern Japan's confidence in itself had been forged. The Mikasa had already survived one disaster. 6 days after the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth, on the night of September 11th, 1905, her forward magazine exploded while she lay at anchor in Sasebo Harbor. The ship sank at her moorings, and hundreds of her crew perished. The exact death toll remains disputed among historians, with figures ranging from roughly 250 to as many as 339. The cause was never definitively established, but Japan could not allow the ship to remain on the bottom. She was refloated in 1906, repaired, rearmed with newer 45 caliber guns, and returned to active service in 1908. She went on to serve in coastal defense during the First World War and the Siberian intervention, ran aground off the Russian coast in 1921, and was towed home for repairs before her final decommissioning. Togo himself died on May 30th, 1934, at the age of 86. He had been elevated to the rank of Marquis just one day before his death. He was given a state funeral, only the 10th since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, an honor reserved for the most consequential figures in the life of the nation. The entire country mourned. He was later enshrined at the Togo Shrine in the Harajuku district of Tokyo, formally dedicated in 1940, a place of pilgrimage for Japanese who wished to honor the man who had proved their nation's strength to the world. And Chester Nimitz, by then a captain in the United States Navy, traveled to Japan to attend the funeral. Not merely the public ceremony, which drew thousands of mourners and was broadcast on radio across the nation. Nimitz was invited to, and attended, a private family observance as well. This was an extraordinary privilege for any foreigner, let alone a foreign naval officer. It reflected a recognition by Togo's family and the Japanese naval establishment that Nimitz's admiration for Togo was not performative but genuine, rooted in something deeper than professional courtesy. This detail matters enormously for what came later. Nimitz was not paying a diplomatic call. He was not cultivating a relationship for strategic advantage. In 1934, the United States and Japan were not yet enemies, but neither were they close allies. The relationship between the two navies was professional but wary, shaped by competing interests in the Pacific and by the shadow of naval arms limitation treaties that both nations were already questioning. Nimitz could have sent a telegram of condolence and satisfied every obligation of protocol. Instead, he crossed the Pacific to stand at the funeral of a man he had met once, nearly 30 years earlier, at a garden party where they had shared a sip of champagne and a few words of conversation. That is not a diplomatic gesture. That is something personal, something that goes to the core of who a man is. The bond between Nimitz and the memory of Togo ran beneath politics, beneath national interest, beneath the gathering clouds of a conflict that, in just 7 years, would pit their two nations against each other in the most devastating naval war the world had ever seen. And then the war came. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Nimitz was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet just weeks later, taking command of a shattered force. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific from Hawaii to the Philippines falling under Japanese control. The men under his command were demoralized, frightened, and uncertain whether the fleet could be rebuilt before Japan consolidated its conquests across half the ocean. But Nimitz was the grandson of a merchant seaman who had taught him not to worry about things he could not control. He took command at Pearl Harbor on December 31st, 1941, looked at what he had left, assessed what could be salvaged, what could be repaired, and what had to be rebuilt from scratch, and he began to fight. At Midway, in June of 1942, acting on intelligence from his codebreakers who had cracked the Japanese naval cipher, Nimitz positioned his 3 remaining carriers in ambush. His pilots fatally crippled 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day, 3 of them hit in one devastating morning strike, destroying the striking arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy and turning the strategic tide of the Pacific War. It was the kind of decisive, war-changing engagement that Togo would have recognized instantly, a battle where preparation, intelligence, and audacity combined to produce a result so complete that the enemy never fully recovered from it. In the years that followed, he orchestrated the island-hopping campaign that drove Japanese forces back across thousands of miles of ocean, the Coral Sea, the Solomons, the Gilberts, and Marshalls. The Marianas, where the Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Later Gulf, in October of 1944, the largest naval battle in history, where the Imperial Japanese Navy committed its remaining capital ships in a desperate gamble and lost most of them. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the bloody final stepping stones toward the Japanese home islands. Battle by battle, island by island, carrier strike by carrier strike. Nimitz's fleets destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy so completely that by the summer of 1945, Japan had virtually no operational warships remaining afloat. The navy that Togo had built, the navy that had stunned the world at Tsushima, the navy that had trained its officers under Togo's portrait in every classroom, was gone. And on September 2nd, 1945, Nimitz signed the surrender documents on the deck of the Missouri, and the war was over. This should have been the end of the story. The conqueror had won. The conquered had submitted. The symbols of the old order were being swept away across Japan with industrial efficiency. No one would have questioned Nimitz if he had never visited the Mikasa. No one would have noticed if he had allowed the occupation authorities to strip it bare, scrap it for metal, or let it disintegrate inside its concrete tomb. That is what conquerors do. Throughout recorded history, the first act of a victorious army entering an enemy's capital has almost always been the destruction or humiliation of that enemy's most sacred symbols. The Romans did not simply defeat Carthage. They leveled the city, burned its temples, and according to tradition sowed the fields with salt so nothing would grow. Napoleon's armies stripped the conquered nations of Europe of their art, their trophies, and their cultural treasures. The Soviets melted, captured German warships for scrap after 1945, erasing from physical existence the vessels that had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine. In the Pacific theater itself, the Japanese had done it to others, tearing down colonial monuments across Southeast Asia and replacing them with their own. Erasure of the enemy's symbols is not an aberration of war. It is one of war's oldest rituals. It is what victors have always done to make certain that the defeated understand, in their bones, that the old order is finished. And yet Nimitz refused to participate in that ritual. He went to the Mikasa on the day of surrender, not as a tourist, not out of idle curiosity, as a man who understood, with absolute clarity, what that ship meant and what was about to happen to it if no one intervened. He had watched the occupation policy take shape in the weeks leading up to the surrender ceremony. He knew that the systematic dismantling of Japan's military identity was accelerating daily, and that the pressure to be thorough was immense. The political imperative was clear. Japan's military culture had produced horrors that the world was still cataloguing, from prisoner of war camps to medical experiments, and the men charged with the occupation were determined that those horrors would never be repeated. Nimitz understood that imperative. He did not oppose it. But he also understood something that the policy, in its thoroughness, could not account for. He understood the difference between a culture's militarism and a culture's history, between the ideology that had led to aggression and the traditions that preceded it by centuries. The Mikasa was not a symbol of the war that had just ended. She was a relic of a battle fought 40 years before Pearl Harbor, a battle in which Japan had fought honorably against a European imperial power and won. Destroying her would not prevent the next war. It would only deepen the wound of this one. And Nimitz knew something else, something deeper still. He knew that once a thing like the Mikasa is destroyed, the destruction is permanent in ways that go beyond steel and rivets. He had watched the occupation policy take shape. He knew that the systematic dismantling of Japan's military identity was accelerating daily. He knew that the Mikasa, as the single most powerful symbol of Japanese naval greatness, was a natural target for that dismantling. And he knew something else, something deeper. He knew that once a thing like that is destroyed, the destruction is permanent. You can rebuild a hull. You can fabricate new guns. But the living thread that connects the ship to the men who served on her, the physical continuity between the steel of the deck and the moment that forged a nation's identity, that thread, once cut, cannot be retied. Nimitz posted the Marine Guard. It was a small act measured against the scale of a war that had killed tens of millions. A handful of men with rifles, standing on the deck of a concrete-bound hulk in a defeated nation's naval yard. But the message contained in that small act was enormous. The most powerful naval commander on Earth was declaring, by his own authority and his own conscience, that this ship would be protected, not because it served American interests, not because it had strategic value, because the history it carried was worth preserving, even the history of an enemy, especially the history of an enemy. The Guard could not save the Mikasa from everything that followed. The occupation ground on for years. Despite the Marines on deck, the ship's remaining fittings were progressively stripped through administrative decisions and casual neglect. The dance hall went up. The aquarium was installed. The Mikasa Preservation Society, which had maintained the ship since the 1920s, was disbanded under occupation directives. By the early 1950s, the Mikasa was barely recognizable as a warship. Her masts were gone. Her guns were gone. The bridge where Togo had stood and watched the Russian fleet disintegrate was buried under temporary commercial structures. To a visitor walking past, she looked like an abandoned barge with a nightclub and a fish tank bolted to her carcass. But the memory of the Mikasa did not die. It could not die, because Tsushima was not merely a naval battle to the Japanese people. It was the foundational event of modern Japanese national confidence. It was the moment when a nation that had been forcibly opened to the outside world by Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 proved that it could meet a European great power on equal terms and destroy it. Before Tsushima, Japan was regarded by most Western governments as a regional power at best, an exotic curiosity at worst. After Tsushima, the world rearranged itself. European empires began to take seriously the idea that their dominance of Asia was not permanent. Independence movements across the continent drew inspiration from Japan's victory. And within Japan itself, Tsushima became the anchor of a national story, the proof that discipline, modernization, and courage could overcome even the most powerful adversary. The Mikasa was the physical embodiment of that story. She was where the story had happened. Without the ship, Tsushima becomes an entry in a textbook, a date to be memorized and forgotten by the next generation. With the ship, it remains real, tangible, visceral. A place where you can stand where Togo stood, where you can touch the same steel that Russian shells struck, where you can look out over the same bow that led the Japanese battle line into the Strait. The ship was not a symbol of Tsushima. The ship was Tsushima. She was the proof that the moment happened, and as long as she existed, the moment could not be reduced to mere words on a page. The first public voice to call for the Mikasa's rescue came from an unexpected quarter. In September of 1955, a man named John Rubin, a Philadelphia businessman who had been born in Barrow-in-Furness, the very English town where the Mikasa had been built half a century earlier, wrote a letter to the Japan Times. Rubin argued that the Mikasa was not merely a Japanese national treasure. She was a piece of world naval heritage, the last surviving pre-dreadnought battleship on Earth, and allowing her to rot was a loss that belonged to everyone. The letter struck a deep chord in a Japan that was beginning to recover economically and culturally, a Japan that was ready to reclaim pieces of its identity without reclaiming the militarism that had nearly destroyed it. But resonance alone could not rebuild a battleship. That required money, it required expertise, it required political will, and it required something harder to obtain than any of those things. It required legitimacy. Someone with enough stature and credibility to demonstrate to the world that restoring a Japanese warship was not an act of remilitarization, but an act of historical preservation. Someone the world would listen to and respect. That someone was Chester Nimitz. In 1959, Nimitz wrote an article for the Japanese monthly magazine Bungei Shunju. He was 74 years old, long retired from active service, living quietly in the San Francisco Bay Area. He had no political position to protect. He had no strategic objective to advance. He had no alliance to manage. What he had was a conviction he had carried since a garden party in 1905, and now he put it into words. In the article, Nimitz argued that the Mikasa was a monument to naval excellence that transcended the boundaries of any single nation. He argued that preserving her honored not Japanese militarism but the seamanship, the courage, and the professionalism of the men who had served aboard her, qualities that belong to all navies and all nations. And then he did something that transformed the argument from words into action. He donated the entire fee he received for writing the article to the Mikasa Restoration Fund. Consider the full weight of what that meant. The man who had destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man who had signed Japan's instrument of surrender, the man who had commanded more warships than any admiral in history, was now writing in a Japanese magazine, arguing that Japan's most sacred naval relic deserved to be saved, and backing that argument with his own money. In the long history of warfare, there is no clean parallel for this. Conquerors have sometimes spared enemy monuments out of indifference. They have sometimes preserved them as trophies of their own triumph. But for a conqueror to actively campaign for the restoration of a defeated enemy's most revered military memorial, to lend his own prestige and his own funds to the cause, and to do so not from political necessity but from personal conviction, that is something the annals of war had rarely, if ever, recorded. This was not strategy. This was not diplomacy. Nimitz was retired. He held no office. He had no political calculation to make, no alliance to manage, no strategic interest to advance. He was a 74-year-old man, living quietly in the San Francisco Bay Area. What he had was a conviction he had carried for more than 50 years, the conviction that the bonds between men who serve at sea, who face the same storms and the same dangers, and bear the same weight of responsibility for the lives of their crews, run deeper than the wars those men are ordered to fight against each other. Nimitz's endorsement broke the dam. The Mikasa Preservation Society was re-established in 1958. Donations began flowing in from every direction. Members of the United States 7th Fleet, stationed at Yokosuka just meters from the Mikasa's berth, contributed alongside Japanese civilians. A United States Navy commander at the Yokosuka base reportedly helped obtain original British construction drawings of the ship from archives in England, a quiet gesture of professional courtesy that carried enormous practical significance for the restoration effort, and across Japan, ordinary citizens opened their wallets. More than 500,000 Japanese, school teachers, factory workers, shopkeepers, fishermen, people who had grown up hearing stories of Tsushima from their parents and grandparents, contributed to the fund. The restoration work began in October of 1959. It was painstaking, expensive, and technically challenging in ways that few people outside the project appreciated. The ship had been so thoroughly stripped during the occupation years that many original components no longer existed anywhere on Earth. The guns had been removed and likely scrapped. The bridge equipment was gone. Navigation instruments, signal lamps, fittings of every description had been carried off as souvenirs or lost during the years of commercial use. Reconstructing the ship's appearance required tracking down photographs, original drawings, and the memories of elderly men who had served aboard her or visited her as schoolchildren before the war. Replacement fittings were sourced from an unlikely and poignant place, the scrapped Chilean battleship Almirante La Torre, originally a British-built dreadnought that had served in the Royal Navy as HMS Canada during the First World War before being sold to Chile. Because both the Mikasa and the Almirante La Torre had been built in British shipyards, many of their components were manufactured to the same standards and specifications, making them compatible in ways that components from other navies would not have been. The 12-inch guns that visitors see mounted on the Mikasa's deck today are carefully manufactured replicas, built to match the dimensions, proportions, and outward appearance of the originals. But the hull beneath the visitor's feet is original. The armor belt that protected the ship's vitals during the battle is original. The basic structure of the vessel, the keel, the frames, the steel plating, those are the same materials that were shaped in a British shipyard at the turn of the 20th century, and that absorbed Russian shell fire on May 27, 1905. The restoration was completed on May 27, 1961. The date was chosen with deliberate precision. It was the 56th anniversary of the Battle of Tsushima. Prince Hitachi, representing the emperor, attended the reopening ceremony at Yokosuka. The total cost of the restoration was 180 million yen. The Mikasa was once again a museum ship, open to the public, restored to an appearance that honored her 1905 configuration. Schoolchildren could walk her decks once more. Families could stand on the bridge where the Z flag had been hoisted. The thread, connecting past and present, severed by war and occupation and neglect, had been restored. Nimitz did not attend the ceremony. He was 76 years old and his health was failing. He would die on February 20th, 1966, at his home on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay, at the age of 80. But he lived long enough to know that the Mikasa had been saved, that the ship he had posted Marines to guard on the afternoon of Japan's surrender had survived the occupation, survived the stripping, survived the dance halls and the aquariums and the years of neglect, and emerged as what it had always been meant to be, a monument to the men who had served aboard her and to the admiral who had led them. And Japan never forgot. The Japanese understanding of obligation is layered and deep. When someone does for you a thing that cannot be repaid because its value lies beyond the reach of money or politics, a particular kind of debt is created. What Nimitz had done, first with the Guard in 1945, and then with the article and the donation in 1959, created exactly that kind of debt. He had given back something that money could not buy and destruction could not undo. He had given back memory. In 1962, the Togo shrine in the Harajuku district of Tokyo, which had been damaged by bombing during the war and fallen into disrepair during the occupation years, was rebuilt. Nimitz contributed royalties from the Japanese translation of his published writings to the shrine's reconstruction fund. The admiral who had destroyed Togo's navy was now helping rebuild Togo's shrine. The symmetry of the gesture was lost on no one in Japan. But the largest and most enduring expression of Japanese gratitude came in 1976, a full decade after Nimitz's death. The people of Japan commissioned a gift for Fredericksburg, Texas, the quiet hill country town where Nimitz had been born and raised by his German immigrant grandfather. The gift was not a plaque or a proclamation. It was a garden. A replica of Admiral Togo's own private garden, designed by Japanese landscape architects and constructed by Japanese craftsmen who traveled from Japan to central Texas to build it entirely by hand, using traditional methods. At its center stood a faithful replica of Togo's personal study, assembled without a single nail in the centuries-old Japanese architectural tradition. The garden was named the Japanese Garden of Peace. It was formally dedicated on May 8, 1976, on the grounds of what is today the National Museum of the Pacific War, the museum built in Nimitz's hometown to honor his legacy and the legacy of all who served in the Pacific. Consider what that gift truly meant. The nation Nimitz had defeated sent its craftsmen across the Pacific to the town where he had been born. They built, with their own hands, a replica of the private garden of the Admiral Nimitz had revered since he was 20 years old. Togo's garden, growing in Texas soil, tended by the community that raised the man who had honored both the warrior and the memory, the midshipman who had sipped champagne with Togo in 1905, the fleet admiral who had destroyed Togo's navy in 1945, the retired officer who had helped save Togo's ship in 1959. And now Togo's garden, living and growing in Nimitz's hometown, built by Japanese hands, offered freely in gratitude for an act of grace that had happened 30 years before. The circle, impossibly, was complete, but it did not stop turning. Every year, the commander of the United States 7th Fleet, whose headquarters sits at Yokosuka Naval Base, just meters from where the Mikasa is berthed, is invited as a guest of honor to the annual commemoration of the Battle of Tsushima held aboard the ship. American and Japanese naval officers stand together on the deck where Togo once commanded, and they mark the anniversary not as a celebration of one nation's victory or another's defeat, but as a shared recognition of the naval traditions that bind them. And in August of 2009, 64 years after Nimitz first walked onto the Mikasa's deck on the day of Japan's surrender, sailors from the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, hull number CVN-68, the supercarrier that bears his name and is the most powerful warship in the history of the world, came ashore at Yokosuka and helped repaint the old battleship. Young American enlisted men and women, most of them born half a century after the Second World War ended, climbed onto the deck of a ship that had fought at Tsushima in 1905 and applied fresh coats of paint to preserve her against the salt air of Tokyo Bay. They were serving aboard a ship named for the man who had saved the Mikasa. They were maintaining the Mikasa with their own hands, their own brushes, and their own labor. The thread connecting Nimitz to Togo, connecting the garden party of 1905 to the surrender of 1945 to the restoration of 1961, now extended to a new generation of sailors who understood, even if they could not have articulated it, that some obligations outlast the men who created them. The Mikasa sits in Yokosuka today, restored, maintained, open to visitors from around the world. She rests in her concrete berth in Mikasa Park, facing the waters of Tokyo Bay, her replica guns still trained on an imaginary horizon. Inside her hull, exhibits trace the story of Tsushima, the life of Togo, and the history of the ship herself. From her construction in England, to her devastation in the occupation, to her resurrection through the effort of 500,000 donors and the endorsement of the man who had destroyed the fleet she once led. She is the last surviving pre-dreadnought battleship on Earth. She is the ship from which Togo commanded the most complete naval victory of the modern age. And she is the ship that a conquering admiral, against the tide of policy, against the weight of precedent, and against every instinct that tells a victor to erase the enemy's symbols, refused to let die. Chester Nimitz grasped a truth that most conquerors throughout history have missed entirely. Destroying an enemy's symbols of pride does not make the peace more durable. It makes the peace more fragile, more resentful, more likely to curdle into the kind of bitterness that produces the next war. A nation stripped of its history does not forget that history. It remembers it more fiercely. It clings to it in secret. It passes it from parent to child in whispered stories that grow angrier with each generation. The stripping does not erase the memory, it poisons it. But a single act of grace, freely offered by the victor to the vanquished at the moment of the vanquished nation's deepest humiliation, does something different. It changes the nature of the memory. It tells the defeated nation that its conqueror does not wish to erase it, does not wish to humiliate it beyond the humiliation of defeat itself, and recognizes that even in the wreckage of a lost war, there are things worth honoring. That kind of act creates a bond more durable than any treaty signed at a conference table, more enduring than any alliance formed from strategic calculation, because it is rooted not in interest but in respect. Nimitz learned that truth from Togo himself, from the man who annihilated the Russian fleet and then went to the hospital to sit at the bedside of the defeated Russian admiral. From the man who commanded the most lopsided naval victory in modern history and then extended to his broken enemy the full measure of professional courtesy and human decency. From the man who proved, in the waters of the Strait of Tsushima, that you could destroy an enemy utterly and still treat him as a fellow sailor who had done his duty with honor. Nimitz absorbed that truth at a garden party when he was 20 years old. He carried it through 60 years of naval service, through the largest and most destructive war in human history, through the systematic annihilation of the very navy Togo had built. And he expressed it, quietly, personally, without speeches or cameras or press releases, on the deck of a concrete-bound hulk in Yokosuka, on the afternoon the greatest war in history came to its end. When Nimitz stood on the Mikasa's deck on September 2nd, 1945, he was not saving a ship. He was saving an idea, the idea that the history of your enemy is still history. That courage deserves to be honored, regardless of the flag it serves. That the truest measure of a conqueror is not what he destroys, but what he chooses to protect when he has the power to destroy everything. The garden in Fredericksburg still grows. The Mikasa still rests in her berth at Yokosuka. The Togo shrine still stands in Harajuku. And the thread that connects a young midshipman from Texas to an aging admiral from Satsuma, first spun over a sip of champagne at a summer garden party in 1905, has never broken. Thank you for spending these minutes with this story. If it reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Pacific, on any side of any war, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and women carried a story that deserves to be heard. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten,